My own daughter shoved me down a flight of concrete stairs and walked away. As I lay in the dark with a shattered hip, her husband looked down from the landing and told her to let me die down there. But before I lost consciousness, I pulled a phone from my pocket and made one single call. What happened next completely erased their existence. I am Richard Caldwell, 65 years old, and this is the story of how I destroyed the monsters I allowed into my home. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that blood does not give anyone the right to treat you like garbage. The argument started over a glossy piece of paper. I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, holding a laundry basket. Melissa stepped directly into my path and shoved a cheap, poorly printed brochure against my chest. The bold letters on the front read Oak Creek Care Center. I did not need to open it to know what it was. It was a state-funded low-income facility for the destitute. It was a place where forgotten people went to wait for the end. I looked at my 28-year-old daughter. She was wearing the diamond tennis bracelet I bought her for her college graduation. She crossed her arms and stared at me with eyes completely devoid of warmth. She told me it was time to be realistic. She said I was getting too old to manage the house and that my slight limp from a previous knee surgery was a liability. She demanded I sign the deed of my 4-bedroom home over to her and her husband Todd. They needed the equity to expand their lifestyle. I reminded her that I owned this house outright. I reminded her that I allowed them to move in rent-free 2 years ago so Todd could focus on his failing tech startup. I had given them the master bedroom. I had retreated to the guest room. I paid the property taxes. I paid for the groceries. I paid the utility bills. I asked her how she could possibly stand in my hallway and tell me I was the one who needed to leave. Todd stepped out of the kitchen. He was holding a cup of coffee I had brewed. He looked at me with a smirk that made my blood run cold. He told me I had until the end of the week to sign the transfer papers, or he would pack my belongings in garbage bags and leave them on the front lawn. He said I was legally a tenant and he would change the locks while I was out. I felt a surge of absolute disgust. I realized I was not talking to family. I was negotiating with parasites. I dropped the laundry basket. I told them both to pack their bags immediately. I told them the free ride was over, and they had until midnight to vacate my property. I reached past Melissa to grab the landline phone on the hallway table. I was going to call the police to have them escorted out. Melissa panicked. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. She did not just block my hand. She placed both of her palms squarely on my chest and shoved me with all her strength. My heel caught the edge of the top step. Gravity took over instantly. I fell backward into the dark stairwell. My shoulders hit the sharp wooden edge of the 3rd step. I tumbled out of control. I felt my ribs crack as I slammed against the railing. I hit the solid concrete floor at the bottom of the stairs with a sickening impact. The pain was instantaneous and blinding. A sharp, burning agony exploded through my right hip. I heard the bone shatter. The breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. I lay on the freezing concrete, staring up at the square of light at the top of the stairs. I could not move. Every attempt to shift my weight sent shockwaves of nausea through my nervous system. I tasted blood in my mouth where I had bitten my tongue. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard footsteps approach the edge of the landing. I forced my eyes open. Melissa and Todd were looking down at me. Melissa had her hand over her mouth. She looked scared, but not because I was hurt. She looked scared because of what she had done. Todd did not look scared at all. He looked annoyed. I tried to ask for help. My voice was just a ragged wheeze. Todd placed his hand on the doorknob. He looked down at me in the dark and delivered a sentence I will remember until the day I die. He said maybe now he will get the message, let him die down there. He pulled the door shut. The basement was plunged into absolute blackness. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a heavy click. A moment later, I heard the muffled sound of their car engine starting in the driveway. They were leaving for their weekend anniversary trip. They were going to a luxury resort in Napa Valley, a trip I had paid for as a gift 3 months ago. They were leaving me in the dark with a shattered hip, fully expecting me to bleed out or die of dehydration before they returned on Sunday. The silence of the basement was heavy and oppressive. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional pain was a different kind of agony. I lay on the cold concrete and let the reality of the situation wash over me. I did not scream for help. There was no one to hear me. The thick walls of my house absorbed all sound. Screaming would only waste my energy. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. I had to separate the physical trauma from my mind. In that dark, freezing basement, Richard the father died. The man who had stayed up all night rocking a sick baby to sleep was gone. The man who had written endless checks to cover Todd's business mistakes was gone. The father who made excuses for his daughter's selfishness was dead on the concrete floor. In his place, a cold, calculating tactician woke up. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I did not feel the urge to cry. I felt a profound, icy clarity. I realized that my entire relationship with my daughter was a transaction. I was an automatic teller machine. When the machine stopped dispensing cash and refused to hand over the bank vault, they tried to destroy the machine. I was not going to let them destroy me. I was going to dismantle their lives with surgical precision. I knew exactly how fragile their world was because I was the only thing holding it up. Todd thought he was a brilliant entrepreneur. He thought he had secured millions in venture capital for his tech startup. He did not know that the anonymous holding company funding his dreams was entirely controlled by me. I had funneled my own retirement money into his business through a proxy to save his pride. That contract included severe morality clauses. I had the legal power to freeze every asset he possessed with a single signature. I forced my left hand into the pocket of my trousers. Every millimeter of movement felt like glass tearing through my hip. Sweat poured down my face in the freezing air. It took me 3 agonizing minutes to pull out my emergency cell phone. I gripped the device tightly. I did not dial emergency services first. If I called the police right now, they would arrest Melissa for simple assault. Todd would hire a lawyer using the startup funds I provided. They would post bail. They would fight me in court. They would claim it was an accident. I wanted them to lose everything. I wanted them to face total financial and social annihilation. I unlocked the phone and dialed a private number. It rang twice. Jonathan Pierce answered. Jonathan had been my corporate attorney for 30 years. He was a ruthless, brilliant man who helped me build and sell my logistics empire. He knew all my secrets. He knew the structure of the holding company. I spoke slowly, forcing the words out through the pain. I told him to execute Protocol Omega. Jonathan went completely silent for 2 seconds. Protocol Omega was a contingency plan we drafted years ago. It meant I was under severe threat and required immediate unilateral transfer of all my assets into an impenetrable trust. It meant activating the destruction clauses on all conditional investments, including Todd's company. Jonathan asked me where I was and what had happened. I told him I was locked in my own basement with a broken hip, and my daughter put me here. I told him to lock down the accounts, transfer the deed of my house to the commercial trust, and then call an ambulance to my address. I ended the call and dropped the phone on the concrete. The trap was set. The gears of their destruction were already turning. Now I just had to survive the night. 30 minutes later, the silence was shattered by the sound of heavy boots on my front porch. I heard the loud, authoritative voices of paramedics. I heard the splintering crack of wood as they broke down the front door. Heavy footsteps rushed down the hallway. The deadbolt on the basement door was smashed open. Flashlights cut through the darkness, blinding me. 2 paramedics rushed down the stairs, their radios crackling. They knelt beside me, assessing my injuries, shouting medical jargon to each other. They carefully stabilized my neck and began preparing a backboard. A police officer walked down the stairs, shining his flashlight around the room. He looked at the locked door, then looked down at me. He asked me directly what happened and who locked the door. I looked at the officer. My hip was screaming in agony. My vision was blurring at the edges. I knew that one word from me would send squad cars to intercept Melissa and Todd on the highway. But that was not the plan. The plan required them to believe they had won. The plan required them to walk back into this house thinking they were the masters of the universe. I took a shallow breath and lied. I told the officer I tripped in the dark while carrying laundry. I told him the door must have blown shut, and the old lock jammed. The officer looked skeptical, but he wrote it down in his notebook. The paramedics lifted me onto the stretcher. The pain caused me to black out for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes again, they were loading me into the back of the ambulance. The cold night air hit my face. I looked back at my house. The front door was splintered and broken. The house was empty. Melissa and Todd were drinking champagne in Napa Valley, toasting to my demise. They had no idea that while they were celebrating, I had just erased their entire future. I closed my eyes as the ambulance sirens began to wail, ready to begin the next phase of the war from my hospital bed. I floated up from the deep chemical sleep of anesthesia. The transition felt like breaking through thick ice into a freezing reality. The harsh fluorescent lights of the recovery room burned through my eyelids. A rhythmic beeping tracked my heartbeat. I tried to shift my weight, and a sharp jolt of absolute agony shot through my right side. My hip was heavily bandaged and throbbing with a dull heat. The surgeon had spent 4 grueling hours reconstructing my shattered bone with titanium plates and heavy medical screws. I was trapped in this hospital bed, temporarily crippled, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I looked at the digital clock mounted on the pale green wall. It was Tuesday morning. 2 days had passed since my daughter shoved me down the stairs. 2 days since Melissa and Todd locked the door and left me. They were still in Napa Valley sipping expensive wine on my dime, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to open up and swallow them whole. A heavy knock broke my concentration. The door swung open, and a man in a wrinkled gray suit walked into the room. He held a thick manila folder in his left hand and a steaming paper cup of coffee in his right. He flashed a silver badge clipped to his leather belt. He introduced himself as Detective Lawson from the local precinct. He had a weathered face and intensely observant eyes. He pulled a plastic chair to the side of my bed and sat down without offering any empty sympathies. He opened the folder and took out the incident report filed by the responding officers. He looked at me with a cold, calculating gaze. He told me the paramedics had to use a heavy steel battering ram to destroy my front door. He said they found me unconscious at the bottom of the basement stairs with a severe compound fracture. Then he leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and stated the most glaring inconsistency in the entire police report. He said the basement door was deadbolted from the hallway side. Detective Lawson asked me how a grown man goes down to the basement to do laundry and somehow locks a heavy deadbolt behind himself from the outside. He watched my face closely for any sign of panic or deception. He told me the responding officer noted that my large house was completely empty. He asked exactly where my daughter and son-in-law were during the incident. He was fishing for the truth. He suspected elder abuse. His professional instincts were perfectly accurate. If I told him what really happened on that landing, he would issue a felony arrest warrant before lunch. Melissa would be dragged out of her luxury resort in handcuffs. But a simple assault charge was not enough for me. The broken justice system would offer her a favorable plea deal. Todd would use the tech startup money I secretly provided to hire a brilliant defense attorney. They would paint me as a confused old man and walk away with a slap on the wrist. I needed them to feel completely invincible so they would walk straight into the financial guillotine I had meticulously prepared. I forced a look of deep embarrassment onto my face. I let my voice tremble slightly, adopting the pathetic persona of a frail senior citizen whose mind was slipping. I looked down at my pale hands resting on the blanket and let out a long, shaky sigh. I told Detective Lawson that I was simply becoming clumsy in my old age. I explained that the house was built decades ago and the basement door had a faulty, unpredictable latch. I said I had left the door propped open to carry my laundry basket, but a strong draft from an open window must have slammed it shut. I claimed the violent impact caused the heavy deadbolt to slide into place, effectively locking me inside the stairwell. I told him I panicked in the dark, tripped over my own feet, and tumbled down the steep wooden steps. It was a humiliating story. It painted me as incompetent and dangerously helpless. It tasted like bitter ash in my mouth to say the words out loud, but I delivered the performance flawlessly. Detective Lawson did not look convinced at all. He tapped his metal pen against the edge of the manila folder in a slow, steady rhythm. He told me that forensic evidence showed the deadbolt was fully and firmly engaged, which almost always requires manual human force. He asked me one last time if anyone else was in the house with me that afternoon. He offered me a lifeline, promising to arrange police protection if I was afraid of my family members. I looked him directly in the eyes and slowly shook my head. I told him Melissa and Todd had left for an anniversary trip hours before I decided to do the chores. I insisted it was my own stupid mistake and specifically asked him not to bother my daughter while she was on her vacation. The detective stared at me for a long, silent moment. He realized I was absolutely not going to give him the statement he needed to pursue a criminal investigation. Without a cooperating victim, his hands were legally tied. He closed the folder with a sharp, frustrated snap. He stood up, pulled a crisp white business card from his jacket pocket, and placed it on the tray table next to my bed. He told me to call his direct line the moment my memory of the event suddenly improved. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. I picked up his card and tucked it safely under my pillow. The false baseline was officially set. The police investigation was successfully neutralized for now. Melissa and Todd would return home on Sunday, believing they had gotten away with attempted murder. They would think I was too weak and too terrified to speak the truth. Their monumental arrogance would be their absolute undoing. My attorney was already executing the massive asset transfers and locking down the trusts. The trap was fully armed and hidden in the shadows. Now I just had to wait patiently for the rats to come back to the house. The door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the sterile silence of the hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me company. I stared at the blank white ceiling. The narcotic painkillers were trying to pull my brain back into a chemical fog, but I refused to let my mind dull. I needed to stay incredibly sharp. Every throb of pain radiating from my surgically repaired hip was a stark reminder of the mission. I was not just a victim recovering in a hospital bed. I was an architect finalizing a demolition. My thoughts drifted to Todd. I pictured his smug face looking down at me in the dark basement. Todd genuinely believed he was a titan of industry. He walked around my house in tailored Italian suits, drinking my expensive scotch, talking loudly on his phone about synergy and market disruption. He thought he was a self-made millionaire on the verge of changing the world with his software company. The absolute delusion of the man was staggering. Todd was not a genius. He was a parasite wearing a silk tie. 3 years ago, Todd was drowning in debt. His first 2 business ventures had collapsed entirely due to his own sheer incompetence and arrogance. He had burned through his personal savings. He had secretly drained my daughter's college fund, which I had generously transferred to her when she married him. They were on the brink of total bankruptcy. Melissa had come to me sobbing in the kitchen late one night. She begged me to save them. She pleaded with me to invest in Todd's new tech startup, claiming it was his final chance to prove himself. I had just finalized the sale of my commercial logistics empire. I had more liquid capital than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But I knew that simply handing Todd a check would destroy whatever shred of pride he had left, and he would resent me for it. I wanted to protect my daughter's marriage. I wanted to give them a solid foundation. So I made the biggest mistake of my life. I decided to help them in absolute secret. I called Jonathan Pierce into my private study. We spent 3 days constructing a completely untraceable financial apparatus. We created a shadow entity named Vanguard Horizon Ventures. It was an anonymous holding company registered offshore, buried under layers of impenetrable corporate privacy laws. On paper, it was a ruthless elite venture capital firm. In reality, it was just me sitting at my mahogany desk, funding my arrogant son-in-law with my own retirement money. Vanguard Horizon Ventures officially approached Todd with an investment offer. We injected $3 million in seed capital into his failing software company. I will never forget the day Todd rushed into my living room waving the term sheet in my face. He was practically vibrating with arrogance. He bragged that a major institutional investor had recognized his unparalleled brilliance. He told me that traditional businessmen like me simply did not understand the modern digital economy. I smiled, congratulated him, and poured him a glass of my best whiskey. I let him believe he was a king. With that $3 million, Todd and Melissa transformed into monsters. They leased luxury vehicles and parked them in my driveway. They bought designer clothes and filled my closets. They started taking lavish vacations to Europe and the Caribbean. And while they spent my hidden money like water, their contempt for me grew daily. They moved into my house to save on living expenses, claiming they needed to reinvest their personal income into the business. They took over the master suite. They banished me to the small guest room down the hall. They began treating me like a bothersome roommate, and eventually like a despised servant. They completely forgot that I was the one paying the property taxes and the grocery bills. They viewed my existence as a burden on their glamorous lifestyle. But I was not a foolish old man. I did not build a massive logistics empire by writing blank checks based on blind trust. I was a pragmatic businessman who understood the darkest corners of human nature. When Jonathan Pierce drafted the venture capital contract for Vanguard Horizon Ventures, I insisted on inserting a very specific legal mechanism. Buried deep within the 70 pages of dense corporate jargon was an ironclad morality and ethical conduct clause. This clause was an absolute financial guillotine. It stipulated that if the founder of the company engaged in any illegal activity, demonstrated severe moral turpitude, or was implicated in elder abuse, Vanguard Horizon Ventures had the unilateral right to freeze all operating accounts instantly. Furthermore, the clause granted the holding company the immediate authority to seize all company assets, intellectual property, and personal collateral tied to the business. Todd never read the contract thoroughly. He was too blinded by the $3 million figure printed at the top of the page. He eagerly signed his own death warrant 3 years ago, completely unaware that his father-in-law held the pen. When I lay bleeding on the freezing concrete of my basement and told Jonathan Pierce to execute Protocol Omega, I pulled the lever on that guillotine. At this exact moment, while Todd was likely sitting by a resort pool in Napa Valley, a team of forensic accountants and aggressive corporate lawyers were locking down his entire existence. His business bank accounts were currently showing a balance of absolute zero. His corporate credit cards were dead pieces of plastic. The servers hosting his software were being legally seized. He was a completely ruined man. He just had not checked his email yet. I looked up at the digital clock on the hospital wall. It was nearly noon. Their anniversary trip was scheduled to end today. The luxury resort would have tried to charge his corporate card for the final bill. The card would decline. He would try another. It would also decline. Panic would set in. They would rush back to the city, confused and terrified by the sudden collapse of their wealth. And then they would remember the old man they left locked in the basement. They would come rushing to the hospital. They needed me now more than ever. They needed my house. They needed me to sign the property deed over to them so they could quickly sell it to cover the sudden, inexplicable evaporation of their finances. They would walk through that hospital door, wearing perfect masks of deep concern. Melissa would hold my hand and pretend to cry. Todd would stand in the corner playing the supportive husband. They would bring the low-income nursing home transfer papers, ready to force my signature through intimidation. I adjusted my posture against the stiff hospital pillows. I took a deep breath, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from my ribs. I was completely ready for them. I had spent my entire life building businesses, but this was going to be my ultimate masterpiece. I was going to look my daughter directly in the eyes, smile gracefully, and give her exactly what she wanted, knowing it would drag her straight into a hell of her own making. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open with a dramatic bang. Melissa rushed into the room, gasping for air as if she had just run a marathon. Todd followed closely behind her. They were both still wearing their expensive resort clothing from Napa Valley. Melissa had a designer silk scarf wrapped around her neck, and her face was flushed. She immediately threw herself across my bed, burying her face into my shoulder, and bursting into loud theatrical sobs. She cried out my name, wailing about how terrified she was when she received the phone call from the hospital. Todd stood at the foot of the bed, placing a comforting hand on her back and putting on a mask of deep, solemn concern. A young floor nurse had followed them into the room carrying a clipboard. She looked at my daughter with complete sympathy. The nurse gently touched Melissa on the arm and whispered that I was going to be fine, explaining that the surgery was a success. Melissa looked up at the nurse with tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. She thanked the nurse profusely, playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken daughter to absolute perfection. She talked about how much they loved me and how they had rushed back from their anniversary trip the absolute second they heard the terrible news. I lay perfectly still against the stiff hospital pillows. I endured the sickening weight of her body against my shattered hip. I did not say a word. I just watched the performance play out, completely fascinated by the sheer magnitude of her sociopathic lying. The nurse checked my intravenous drip, gave us a warm smile, and quietly backed out of the room, closing the heavy door behind her. The click of the latch echoed in the silent room. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The very second the door clicked shut, Melissa stopped crying. She pushed herself off my chest, wiped the fake tears from her cheeks, and smoothed out the wrinkles in her expensive silk blouse. The look of deep concern completely vanished from Todd's face, replaced immediately by a look of cold, calculating irritation. He checked his heavy gold watch, crossed his arms, and leaned against the cold cinder block wall. The loving family illusion evaporated, leaving only the two parasites I had allowed into my home. Melissa pulled a sleek leather folder from her designer handbag and tossed it onto my tray table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. She opened it to reveal a stack of legal documents and the same glossy brochure for the Oak Creek Care Center that had started this entire nightmare 2 days ago. She pulled a silver pen from her purse and placed it deliberately next to the papers. She did not ask how my surgery went. She did not ask about my pain. She looked directly into my eyes, with a gaze as cold as absolute zero. She told me that the doctors said I would need months of physical therapy and round-the-clock care. She stated that neither she nor Todd had the time or the inclination to be my nurses. She tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the top document. It was a voluntary transfer of medical and financial power of attorney paired with admission papers for the low-income state facility. It also included a quitclaim deed, completely surrendering my 4-bedroom home to her. I looked at the papers and then looked back at her. I asked her what made her think I would ever sign away my life to the people who left me to die on a concrete floor. Todd let out a short, cruel laugh from the corner of the room. He walked over to the side of my bed and looked down at me with absolute contempt. He told me that I did not have a choice anymore. He said they had already spoken to the police downstairs. He smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and thanked me for lying to the detective. He told me that my story about tripping in the dark and locking myself in the basement was the greatest gift I could have ever given them. Melissa leaned in incredibly close to my face. I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. Her voice dropped to a vicious serpentine whisper. She told me that if I did not sign these papers voluntarily right now, she was going to go straight to a judge. She said she would use my own police statement against me to prove that I was suffering from severe dementia and cognitive decline. She threatened to declare me legally incompetent and a danger to myself. She promised that if she had to take emergency conservatorship through the courts, she would not put me in the Oak Creek Care Center. She promised she would find the absolute worst, most underfunded psychiatric ward in the entire state and lock me away in a room with padded walls where no one would ever hear from me again. She picked up the silver pen and pressed it into my right hand. She curled my fingers around the cold metal. She told me to stop being stubborn and accept my new reality. She said I had lived a good life, but my time was over, and it was their turn to enjoy my wealth. She commanded me to sign the documents and be grateful they were even bothering to handle my transition. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. I needed them to believe they had completely broken my spirit. I needed them to feel a false sense of absolute victory. I let my hand begin to shake violently. I let my breathing become rapid and shallow, simulating a panic attack. I darted my eyes between the two of them, projecting pure, unadulterated terror. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced a single, pathetic tear down my cheek. I whispered that they could not do this to me. I begged them in a frail, broken voice to let me go home. Todd sneered in disgust. He grabbed the back of my hospital bed and shook it slightly, sending a flare of blinding pain through my hip. He told me to shut up and sign the damn papers before they left me to rot in this bed. I kept my hand shaking. I slowly lowered the tip of the silver pen to the signature line of the first document. I hesitated, letting out a soft, defeated sob. Melissa tapped the paper impatiently. I pressed the pen down and signed my name. I moved to the next page and signed again. I signed away my medical rights. I signed the admission forms for the wretched nursing home. I signed the quitclaim deed to my beautiful house. I signed every single page they put in front of me, making sure my handwriting looked weak and erratic. When I finished the final signature, the pen slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered onto the floor. I let my head fall back against the pillow and closed my eyes, acting like a man who had just lost his entire soul. Melissa snatched the documents off the tray table with lightning speed. She quickly inspected every single signature, a look of pure, greedy ecstasy spreading across her face. She slid the papers back into her leather folder and snapped it shut. She looked at Todd and nodded. The transaction was complete. They had extracted everything they wanted from me. Melissa did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not say goodbye. She turned her back on me and walked briskly toward the door. Todd followed her, pausing only to look back at me one last time. He gave me a mocking salute, smiled his arrogant smile, and stepped out into the hallway. The heavy wooden door swung shut, leaving me alone in the silence once again. I opened my eyes. The shaking in my hands instantly stopped. The pathetic, terrified expression completely vanished from my face. I reached under my hospital pillow and pulled out the burner phone I had hidden there. The papers I had just signed were completely legally meaningless. They were entirely void. They were void because 12 hours ago my attorney, Jonathan Pierce, had already legally transferred all of my assets, including the house, into an irrevocable commercial trust that I did not directly control. Furthermore, my medical power of attorney had already been legally transferred to Jonathan Pierce early this morning. Melissa and Todd thought they were walking out of this hospital as millionaires. They thought they owned my home. They thought they controlled my medical destiny. In reality, they were walking out holding a folder full of worthless paper, heading back to a house they no longer owned, funded by a company that had just been legally seized. I dialed Jonathan Pierce's number. The illusion was over. It was time for the midnight escape. The digital clock on the wall read 11:45. The hospital ward was completely silent, except for the low hum of the ventilation system and the occasional squeak of a nurse walking down the hallway. In exactly 8 hours, a transport van from the Oak Creek Care Center would arrive to take me away. Melissa had scheduled it for 8 in the morning, wanting to dispose of me before she and Todd even woke up to enjoy their stolen house. They believed I was trapped. They believed my spirit was broken, and my assets were theirs. I lay in the dim light, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the cavalry I had summoned. At exactly midnight, the heavy door to my room opened with a soft click. It was not a nurse checking my vitals. A tall man, in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, stepped into the room. It was Jonathan Pierce. My attorney did not look like a man visiting a sick friend. He looked like an executioner arriving for a scheduled appointment. Behind him walked a woman carrying a heavy leather briefcase and a man in a crisp white medical uniform. Jonathan walked to the side of my bed and looked down at me. His face was completely unreadable, a mask of pure professional detachment. He did not offer any empty sympathies about my broken hip. He simply nodded and said it was time to go to work. Jonathan introduced the woman as a private notary public. He introduced the man as the head of a private medical transport team waiting at the loading dock. Jonathan snapped his briefcase open and placed a thick stack of documents on my tray table. These were not the cheap downloaded forms Melissa had shoved in my face hours earlier. These were ironclad, heavily drafted legal instruments designed to completely dismantle my daughter's entire future. Jonathan handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. He explained the first document. It was a complete and immediate revocation of the medical and financial power of attorney I had just signed for Melissa. Because I was currently of sound mind and signing in the presence of an independent legal notary, the documents Melissa held were instantly rendered null and void. I gripped the pen firmly. My hand did not shake this time. I signed my name with heavy, deliberate strokes. The notary stamped the page, sealing my daughter's fate. Jonathan moved to the next document. It was the formal activation of the commercial trust. He explained that as of this exact moment, my 4-bedroom house was legally owned by a corporate entity that I did not directly manage. Melissa's quitclaim deed was completely worthless because I no longer owned the property to give it away. The new corporate owners had already issued a formal notice to vacate, which would be delivered to the house in exactly 48 hours. I signed the transfer papers. The notary stamped them. Then came the final and most devastating piece of paperwork. Jonathan pulled out the Vanguard Horizon Ventures executive ledger. He pointed to the clause governing Todd's tech startup. He confirmed that the morality clause had been triggered the moment I called him from the basement. However, this document authorized the immediate liquidation of all company assets to recover my initial $3 million investment. By signing this paper, I was giving Jonathan the legal authority to drain Todd's business accounts, seize his servers, and lock him out of his own office building before sunrise. I looked at the signature line. I thought about Todd telling my daughter to let me die on the concrete floor. I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed the paper. The notary stamped it. The financial guillotine was officially armed and ready to drop. Jonathan gathered the documents and placed them safely inside his leather briefcase. He looked at me and said the legal wall was built. Now we had to get me out of the hospital before the morning shift arrived. The medical transport specialist stepped forward. He calmly explained that he had already coordinated my discharge with the hospital administration. Because I was legally sound and under the care of a private physician hired by Jonathan, the hospital had no authority to hold me. I was leaving against medical advice which completely bypassed the transfer orders Melissa had arranged. The specialist signaled into the hallway. 2 more medical technicians entered the room pushing a high-end specialized transport stretcher. Moving me was an incredibly painful process. Despite their careful hands and synchronized movements, the shift from the hospital bed to the stretcher sent waves of hot agony shooting through my newly reconstructed hip. I clenched my jaw and stared at the ceiling, refusing to make a sound. I had survived 2 days on a freezing concrete floor. I could survive a 5-minute transfer. They secured me to the stretcher with heavy nylon straps and covered me with a thick, warm blanket. Jonathan walked out into the hallway first, clearing the path. The medical technicians rolled my stretcher out of the room. We did not go toward the main lobby. We moved silently down the dimly lit corridor toward the service elevators. We passed the nurses' station, where the night staff simply nodded at my attorney. Money and influence moved mountains, and Jonathan Pierce knew how to navigate both flawlessly. The elevator doors opened, and we descended into the basement of the hospital. It felt poetic. My nightmare had started in a dark basement, and my rebirth was beginning in another. We exited through the loading dock doors. The cold night air washed over my face, carrying the scent of rain and city asphalt. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever smelled. A sleek, unmarked medical transport van was waiting with its rear doors open. They carefully loaded me into the back of the van. The interior was like a mobile intensive care unit, brightly lit and packed with advanced medical equipment. Jonathan stepped up to the open doors and looked at me one last time before we departed. He told me that my new accommodations at the private rehabilitation estate were fully prepared and highly secure. He promised me that by the time I woke up tomorrow, Melissa and Todd would be living in a completely different reality. He stepped back, and the heavy doors slammed shut, plunging me into a quiet, secure environment. The van engine started with a low rumble. We pulled out of the hospital loading dock and merged onto the empty city streets. I looked out the small tinted window as we drove away from the building. In just a few hours, the sun would rise. Melissa would wake up in my house completely oblivious to the fact that she was a trespasser. She would wait for the nursing home transport to call her, eager to hear that I had been locked away. Instead, she was going to face a completely empty hospital bed and a voided legal contract. And Todd would try to buy his morning coffee only to discover that his credit cards were dead plastic and his entire company had been seized by an invisible hand. I closed my eyes and let the gentle rocking of the van lull me to sleep. The pain in my hip was still there, but the crushing weight of betrayal was completely gone. I was no longer a victim waiting for the end. I was a ghost vanishing into the night, leaving behind a perfectly constructed trap for the monsters who thought they had buried me. I woke up to the sound of birds singing outside a massive bay window. The morning sunlight poured across my bed, illuminating a room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a medical facility. I was no longer in the sterile environment of the public hospital. I was at the crest of a private, highly secure rehabilitation estate nestled deep in the wooded hills. The grounds were patrolled by private security. The gates required a biometric scan to open. No one could find me here. I was completely unreachable to the people who wanted me dead. My physical therapist was a former military medic named David. He arrived at 8 in the morning sharp, carrying a custom walker and a look of absolute determination. The next 2 hours were an exercise in pure agony. David forced me out of the comfortable bed. He made me put weight on my reconstructed hip. Every single step sent shockwaves of fire up my spine. Sweat poured down my face. My muscles screamed in protest. But I did not complain. I embraced the pain. The physical torment was a necessary fire burning away the weak father I used to be. Every grueling step across that hardwood floor was a step toward my complete restoration. I focused my mind entirely on the image of Todd, standing at the top of my basement stairs. By the time David allowed me to sit in the heavy leather recliner by the window, I was physically exhausted, but mentally sharper than a razor. At exactly noon, the heavy mahogany door to my suite opened. Jonathan Pierce walked in carrying his signature leather briefcase and a secure tablet. He transformed my recovery room into a corporate command center. He pulled a chair up to my recliner and opened his briefcase. The peaceful view of the manicured gardens outside was a stark contrast to the absolute financial slaughter we were orchestrating inside. Jonathan handed me a cup of black coffee and placed a thick stack of finalized legal documents on the small table beside me. Jonathan briefed me on the morning activities. He told me the commercial trust had officially absorbed the deed to my house. The state registry was fully updated. Melissa and Todd were now legally occupying a property owned by a faceless corporate entity. Jonathan smiled a cold, professional smile. He informed me that he had just dispatched the official 72-hour eviction notice via a private process server. The clock was officially ticking on their fraudulent domestic bliss. I set my coffee cup down and picked up the heavy gold pen. Jonathan placed the first document in front of me. It was the formal asset seizure authorization for Vanguard Horizon Ventures. Jonathan explained that the forensic accounting team had spent the entire night mapping Todd's corporate infrastructure. They had identified his primary operating accounts, his payroll reserves, and his offshore tax shelters. I stared at the signature line. This single stroke of ink would instantly freeze $3 million. It would trigger automatic clawback protocols legally draining every single cent Todd possessed to repay the breached investment contract. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with absolute precision. Jonathan slid the next document over. It was a formal directive to the bank holding Todd's business credit cards. Because the holding company legally guaranteed those lines of credit, activating the morality clause allowed me to instantly sever that guarantee. I signed the directive. In that exact moment, the plastic cards resting in Todd's expensive leather wallet turned into completely worthless garbage. The third document was a legal injunction against the servers hosting Todd's tech startup. Jonathan explained that because my holding company owned the intellectual property as collateral, we had the legal right to lock the entire system down pending a full audit. I signed the injunction. Thousands of lines of code and years of Todd's supposed brilliant work were instantly locked behind an impenetrable digital firewall. He was entirely locked out of his own creation. I handed the pen back to Jonathan. The physical pain in my hip was a dull throb completely overshadowed by the immense satisfaction of total control. I asked Jonathan what the timeline looked like. He checked his tablet and told me the bank freezes were already propagating through the financial network. The credit card cancellations would take effect in less than an hour. The server lockouts were happening as we spoke. I leaned back in the leather recliner and looked out the window. Melissa and Todd had returned from their luxurious anniversary trip, expecting to find me terrified and compliant. They had spent the last 3 days living in my house, sleeping in my bed, and drinking my wine, completely oblivious to the invisible net closing around them. They thought they had won the war by shoving an old man down the stairs. They did not realize the old man owned the stairs, the house, and the very ground they walked on. Jonathan packed his briefcase and stood up to leave. He told me the process server would deliver the eviction notice to the house tomorrow morning. He advised me to rest and focus on my physical therapy, promising to monitor the financial collapse from his office. I thanked him and watched him walk out the door. I was alone again, but I did not feel lonely. I felt a profound sense of purpose. I picked up my tablet and opened the live feed from the hidden security cameras I had installed around my property years ago. I settled in to watch my daughter and her husband face the absolute destruction of their entire reality. Melissa poured herself a double shot of espresso using the imported Italian machine sitting on my kitchen counter. She took a slow, deeply satisfying sip and looked out through the massive bay windows at the manicured backyard. It was Wednesday morning, just hours after they had forced me to sign my life away in that dim hospital room. She was wearing a pristine white silk robe, acting exactly like the lady of the manor. There was not a single ounce of guilt in her body. She did not feel remorse for shoving her own father down a flight of concrete stairs. She did not feel a shred of pity leaving me to rot in a state-funded facility. She only felt the intoxicating rush of unearned wealth. She turned to Todd, who was sitting at the custom mahogany dining table tapping away on his silver laptop. She told him they needed to move aggressively. She wanted the house listed on the market by Friday afternoon. She calculated that my property, located in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the county, would easily fetch over $2 million. Todd did not look up from his screen. He simply nodded and agreed, stating that the sudden injection of cash would allow them to upgrade to a massive penthouse downtown, while simultaneously expanding his software company. They were dividing my corpse before it was even cold. They had invited Evelyn Cross to the house for a 9 o'clock appointment. Evelyn was the most ruthless, successful, and exclusive real estate broker in the city. She only handled multi-million-dollar estates, and she was exactly the kind of shark Melissa wanted to represent her stolen asset. Right on schedule, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the hallway. Melissa practically glided across the hardwood floor to open it. Evelyn stepped into the foyer, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and carrying a sleek leather portfolio. She possessed an air of total professional dominance. Melissa welcomed her in with a sickeningly sweet smile, offering her coffee and pastries. Evelyn politely declined the refreshments. She stated that her schedule was incredibly tight and she preferred to get straight to business. Melissa eagerly led Evelyn on a grand tour of the property. She walked through my home, pointing out the architectural details, the vaulted ceilings, and the custom crown molding. But with every step, Melissa made sure to insult my legacy. She called the expensive Persian rugs tacky and outdated. She told Evelyn that the dark wood-paneled library smelled like an old man and needed to be completely gutted. She acted as if she had personally suffered through years of living in squalor and was finally ready to present a diamond in the rough to the market. Todd trailed behind them, occasionally chiming in to boast about the square footage, as if he had built the house with his own bare hands. Evelyn remained perfectly neutral. She took precise notes on her digital tablet, her eyes scanning the rooms, calculating the exact market value of every square inch. When the tour concluded, the three of them sat down at the large dining room table. Melissa folded her hands together and leaned forward, practically vibrating with greed. She asked Evelyn what the initial listing price should be and how quickly they could expect an all-cash offer. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She placed her tablet on the table and opened a specific application. She tapped the screen a few times, her manicured brow furrowing in slight confusion. The air in the room suddenly shifted. The confident, arrogant energy radiating from Melissa and Todd hid an invisible wall of professional hesitation. Evelyn looked up from her screen and adjusted her posture. She asked Melissa in a very calm and measured tone to clarify her exact legal relationship to the property. Melissa laughed a sharp, arrogant sound. She proudly declared that she was the sole legal owner. She explained that her elderly father had recently suffered a terrible accident, experienced a severe mental decline, and had voluntarily signed the entire estate over to her just last night. She spoke about my fictional dementia with a chilling lack of emotion. Evelyn did not smile. She turned the tablet around and pushed it across the polished mahogany table so Melissa and Todd could see the screen. Evelyn explained that her brokerage requires a preliminary title search and public registry check before taking on any new high-end listing, just to ensure there are no hidden liens or legal complications. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a highlighted section of the county database. Evelyn stated that according to the official state registry, which updated at midnight, the property did not belong to Richard Caldwell. Furthermore, it certainly did not belong to Melissa or Todd. The deed to the 4-bedroom estate had been legally and irrevocably transferred to Vanguard Horizon Commercial Trust 2 full days ago. The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute and suffocating. Melissa stared at the glowing screen of the tablet. The words Vanguard Horizon Commercial Trust reflected in her wide, panicked eyes. She blinked rapidly, her brain completely unable to process the information. Todd leaned over his jaw, dropping slightly, as he read the official county seal verifying the digital record. The color completely drained from his face. Melissa suddenly stood up her chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Her voice cracked as she yelled that the database was wrong. She shouted that it was a clerical error, a stupid bureaucratic mistake. She practically sprinted to her designer handbag resting on the kitchen counter. She frantically dug through it and pulled out the leather folder containing the papers I had signed in the hospital. She rushed back to the table, pulled out the quitclaim deed, and slammed it down in front of Evelyn. She pointed at my shaky signature, screaming that she had the physical proof of ownership right there in black and white. Evelyn did not flinch. She was a professional who dealt with legal disputes constantly. She calmly picked up the hospital document and reviewed it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she placed it back on the table and delivered the most devastating sentence my daughter had ever heard. Evelyn explained that a quitclaim deed only transfers the interest a person holds in a property at the exact moment of signing. She looked Melissa directly in the eyes and stated that when Richard Caldwell signed that paper at the hospital last night, he did not own the house. He had already transferred the property to the commercial trust a day prior. Therefore, the hospital document was completely worthless. It was a legally void piece of paper transferring absolutely nothing. Todd grabbed the edge of the table. He started to hyperventilate. The realization hit him like a freight train. He recognized the name Vanguard Horizon. That was the exact same shadowy corporate entity that held the puppet strings to his entire software company. The invisible hand that funded his life was the same hand that now owned the roof over his head. Evelyn stood up, her expression entirely cold and detached. She slid her tablet into her leather portfolio and snapped it shut. She informed them that it is a severe federal offense to attempt to sell a property they do not legally own. She stated that her brokerage would have absolutely nothing to do with this fraudulent listing. She did not wait for them to show her out. She turned on her heel and walked swiftly out the front door, the heavy latch clicking shut behind her with an awful finality. Melissa collapsed back into her chair. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The illusion of her grand, wealthy future shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked across the table at Todd. His arrogant smirk was completely gone. He was staring blankly at the wall, his chest heaving with panic. They were not millionaires preparing to buy a penthouse. They were trespassers sitting in a house owned by a hostile corporation. And they were about to discover that the loss of the house was only the first wave of the tsunami. I watched the live security feed on my tablet as the front door of my house slammed shut. Evelyn, the real estate broker, was gone, leaving my daughter and her husband in a state of absolute shock. Through the hidden camera in the living room, I watched Todd pace back and forth like a trapped animal. The arrogant smirk he usually wore was completely wiped from his face. He ran his hands through his hair and started shouting at Melissa. He told her that Vanguard Horizon Commercial Trust was nothing but a shell company trying to steal their asset. He believed the world still bowed to him. He grabbed his car keys off the kitchen counter. He told his wife he was driving downtown to his office. He promised her he was going to wire a massive financial retainer to the most ruthless litigation firm in the city. He thought he was going to hire an army of corporate lawyers to crush the trust and take my house back by force. He marched out the door fully believing that his tech startup money made him invincible. Todd drove his expensive leased sports car to the downtown business district. I knew exactly what his office looked like because my hidden money had paid for every single square inch of it. He leased the top floor of a premium high-rise. He had decorated it with imported Italian marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, and ridiculously expensive ergonomic furniture. He wanted to project the image of a visionary tech billionaire. He stormed out of the private elevator and walked past his receptionist without even acknowledging her existence. He was a tyrant who treated his employees with the same condescending contempt he had shown me in the basement. He locked the heavy glass door to his corner office, threw his jacket onto the leather sofa, and opened his sleek silver laptop. He immediately picked up his desk phone and called a high-powered defense attorney he had met at a country club. He promised the lawyer a $100,000 wire transfer by the end of the hour to initiate an aggressive lawsuit against the trust. He put the lawyer on speakerphone and confidently typed the web address for his executive corporate banking portal. He navigated to the primary operating account of his software company. This was the massive vault that held the remaining balance of the $3 million I had secretly invested to save his pathetic life 3 years ago. Todd rapidly typed in his complex authorization credentials and hit enter, fully expecting to see a screen filled with commas and zeros. The web page loaded for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the screen did not display his balance. A bright, glaring red banner flashed completely across the top of his expensive monitor. The text read, "Error code 704. Account frozen. Status restricted. Available balance $0.00." Todd stopped breathing. He stared at the screen, his brain entirely unable to process the visual information. He quickly refreshed the web page. He typed his secure password a second time, hitting the keys so hard they clattered loudly in the quiet office. The exact same red banner appeared. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He navigated to the secondary payroll account used to pay his engineers. It was completely locked. The balance was 0. He checked his offshore tax shelter. Access denied. Every single digital vault associated with his name had been instantly and violently emptied. He hung up the phone on the high-powered lawyer without saying a single word. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed his elite platinum business banker. He aggressively bypassed the automated menu system and demanded to speak to the regional corporate manager immediately. The regional manager answered the phone. The man's tone was not the usual groveling, eager submission Todd was accustomed to hearing. The manager's voice was ice-cold, purely administrative, and utterly devoid of respect. Todd practically screamed into the receiver. He demanded to know why a ridiculous system glitch was holding up his critical business capital. He threatened to sue the bank and move his millions to a competitor by the end of the day. The bank manager paused for a long moment, allowing Todd to completely exhaust his arrogant tirade. Then the manager delivered the absolute killing blow. He informed Todd that there was no system glitch. He stated clearly that Vanguard Horizon Ventures, the primary guarantor and sole investor of the startup, had executed an emergency unilateral asset seizure at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Todd felt his throat close up. His voice cracked as he desperately argued that they could not legally do that without a formal board of directors vote. He shouted that he was the chief executive officer and he demanded the freeze be lifted immediately. The bank manager calmly explained that a board vote was absolutely not required when a Level 4 breach of contract protocol was triggered. Todd gripped the edge of his mahogany desk. He demanded to know what the supposed breach of contract was. The manager audibly shuffled some papers on his end of the line. He read directly from the legal injunction filed earlier that morning by my attorney, Jonathan Pierce. He stated that Vanguard Horizon Ventures was exercising its absolute rights under Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Founder Agreement, specifically the Morality and Ethical Conduct Clause. The manager cleared his throat and read the exact legal justification out loud. He stated that the holding company was executing an immediate freeze of all operating capital pending an active police investigation into felony elder abuse, aggravated assault, and gross moral turpitude. The words hung in the air of Todd's expensive corner office like a death sentence. Elder abuse, aggravated assault. The bank manager asked Todd if he needed the police incident report number associated with the financial freeze. Todd dropped the cell phone onto his desk. The connection was still open. The manager's voice buzzing faintly from the speaker, but Todd could not form a single word. The invisible corporate holding company knew exactly what he had done in my basement. The horrific realization crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. The holding company that owned his entire business was called Vanguard Horizon Ventures. The trust that had just legally evicted him from his home was called Vanguard Horizon Commercial Trust. The invisible billionaire investor he had been bragging about to his friends for 3 entire years was the exact same old man he had left to die on the freezing concrete floor. I was Vanguard Horizon. While Todd stood completely paralyzed behind his desk, the second phase of the destruction protocol automatically initiated. The lights on his high-speed internet router flashed violently and then turned solid red. His computer screen suddenly went completely black. A wall of scrolling white text appeared as the servers hosting his precious software were physically and digitally locked down by my cybersecurity team. The proprietary code he thought would make him famous was instantly encrypted and locked behind an impenetrable digital firewall. He was entirely locked out of his own creation. He rushed to his office door and threw it open. The open floor plan of his startup was descending into total chaos. His lead software developers were standing up from their desks, staring in confusion at dead monitors. The receptionist was arguing loudly with three large men in dark charcoal suits who had just stepped out of the elevators. They were corporate auditors accompanied by private security contractors hired directly by Jonathan Pierce. The lead auditor walked straight across the room, ignoring the panicked employees. He walked directly up to Todd. He handed him a thick legal binder and demanded that he surrender his building access card immediately. Todd tried to puff out his chest. He tried to assert his authority and ordered the men to leave his property. The largest security contractor simply stepped forward, placed a heavy hand on Todd's shoulder, and informed him that he was currently trespassing on Vanguard Horizon property. Todd was frog-marched out of his own office. He was paraded past his bewildered employees who watched their arrogant boss get escorted away like a common criminal. He was not allowed to grab his expensive coat. He was not allowed to take his silver laptop or his car keys from his desk. He was shoved into the public elevator and sent down to the street level with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back. Back in my secure recovery suite, my cell phone vibrated on the table. It was a secure text message from Jonathan Pierce. The message contained exactly 2 words: target neutralized, target. I smiled, picked up my cup of black coffee, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. Todd had walked into that office building, believing he was a king preparing to conquer the world. He was thrown out onto the sidewalk 10 minutes later as a completely broken peasant. He had absolutely no money to hire a lawyer. He had no money to pay his rent. He could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee. The parasite had been completely and surgically severed from the host, and his absolute starvation had finally begun. Todd did not drive his leased sports car back to my estate. He could not. His vehicle required a digital authorization key linked directly to his corporate executive account. While he was riding the elevator down to the street level, with the security contractors, my cybersecurity team had remotely deactivated his profile. When Todd reached the underground parking garage, the car completely refused to unlock. His corporate platinum credit card was declined at the automated taxi stand outside the building. His personal bank card was declined when he tried to order a premium rideshare service on his phone. The man who had strutted into his office building believing he was a titan of industry was forced to walk 2 miles in the afternoon heat to a public bus stop. He had to beg a city transit driver to let him ride for free because his expensive leather wallet contained absolutely nothing but dead plastic. When Todd finally pushed open the heavy mahogany front door of my home, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. He stumbled into the grand foyer, his tailored Italian suit soaked in sweat and covered in city dust. Melissa was sitting on the custom velvet sofa in the living room, nervously tapping her designer fingernails against her phone screen. She took one look at her husband's pale, defeated face and immediately demanded to know what the lawyers had said. She asked him how quickly they could file an injunction against the commercial trust and get the house back on the market. Todd collapsed into an armchair across from her. He could not even look her in the eye. He stared at his expensive shoes and delivered the news in a hollow, trembling voice. He told her there were no high-powered lawyers. He told her the business operating accounts were completely frozen. The executive credit lines were canceled, and the software servers were physically locked. He finally looked up at his wife, his eyes wide with absolute terror, and explained the most devastating truth of all. He told her that the anonymous billionaire investor they had worshipped for the past 3 years was not a stranger. It was her father. It was me. Melissa froze. The color completely drained from her face. She tried to speak, but only a dry gasp escaped her lips. Todd continued, his voice cracking with pure panic. He explained that my holding company had triggered a severe morality clause. He told her that I knew exactly what they had done in the basement. I had somehow orchestrated this entire financial slaughter from my hospital bed. They were completely and entirely broke. They did not have enough money to buy a single loaf of bread, let alone hire a corporate defense attorney to fight a billionaire trust. Melissa's initial shock rapidly morphed into a blinding, venomous rage. She absolutely refused to accept defeat. Her sheer arrogance simply would not allow her to believe that the old man she had shoved down the stairs had outsmarted her so thoroughly. She jumped up from the velvet sofa and began pacing the living room like a trapped animal. She shouted that I was bluffing. She screamed that I was just a weak, senile old man who was throwing a pathetic temper tantrum. She desperately convinced herself that I was still physically trapped in that hospital bed, heavily medicated and completely under her legal control. She snatched her cell phone from the coffee table. She told Todd to stop crying like a pathetic child. She declared that she still held the absolute medical and financial power of attorney. She said she was going to call the hospital administration right now, order the doctors to declare me legally incompetent, and force the bank to unfreeze the accounts under her authority. She dialed the main number for the hospital, her hands shaking violently with adrenaline and fury. The phone rang 3 times before a senior administrative nurse answered the call. Melissa did not offer a polite greeting. She launched directly into a vicious, demanding tirade. She aggressively identified herself as the legal guardian and sole power of attorney for Richard Caldwell. She demanded to be transferred to my recovery room immediately. She shouted that she needed to speak to the attending physician right this second to authorize a forced psychiatric evaluation. The nurse on the other end of the line remained perfectly calm, completely immune to Melissa's hysterical demands. The nurse asked Melissa to hold for a moment while she accessed the digital patient records. The silence on the line stretched for 30 agonizing seconds. Melissa tapped her foot impatiently, glaring at Todd, silently promising him that her aggressive tactics were about to fix his massive failure. The nurse returned to the line. Her voice was ice-cold and entirely professional. She informed Melissa that Richard Caldwell was no longer a registered patient at their medical facility. Melissa stopped tapping her foot. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. She demanded to know what the nurse meant by that statement. She asked if I had been transferred to the low-income state nursing home ahead of schedule. She aggressively demanded the address of the new facility immediately. The nurse corrected her with absolute bureaucratic precision. She stated that Richard Caldwell was not transferred to any state facility. She explained that at exactly midnight, I had been formally discharged against medical advice. I had walked out of the hospital, or rather rolled out in a private medical transport, accompanied by my own personal legal counsel. Melissa completely lost her temper. She screamed into the phone that the hospital had committed a massive illegal act. She shouted that she held the medical power of attorney and the staff had absolutely no right to release a severely injured, mentally incompetent patient without her direct written consent. She threatened to sue the hospital, the nurses, and the entire medical board for criminal negligence and malpractice. The nurse did not flinch at the threats. She simply read directly from the legal notes attached to my newly updated file. She informed Melissa that a private notary and a senior corporate attorney had visited my room at midnight. She stated clearly that I had executed a legally binding, fully notarized revocation of all previous power of attorney documents. She told Melissa that the papers she currently held were completely void and legally worthless. Furthermore, the nurse explained that my new legal representative, Jonathan Pierce, had placed a strict privacy block on my entire medical file. The hospital was legally forbidden from disclosing my current location, my medical status, or any further information to anyone, specifically including my daughter. Before Melissa could scream another threat, the nurse politely wished her a good day and disconnected the call. The line went completely dead. Melissa slowly lowered the phone from her ear. Her hand was trembling so violently she dropped the device onto the hardwood floor. It landed with a sharp crack, but she did not even look down. The absolute reality of her situation finally shattered her delusions of grandeur. I was not trapped. I was not heavily medicated. I was entirely gone. I had vanished into thin air, leaving her standing in my living room, holding a folder full of worthless paper. She looked at Todd. The massive house suddenly felt incredibly silent and cold. They were completely isolated. They had no money. They had no business. They had absolutely no legal authority over me. And worst of all, they had no idea where I was or what I was going to do next. The invisible net had pulled completely tight around them. Panic set in, pure and unadulterated. Todd stood up from the armchair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He pointed out the massive bay windows toward the front driveway. He reminded her of the eviction notice the real estate broker had mentioned. He said the commercial trust would soon send armed police officers to drag them out of the house. He suggested they pack their bags and run before things got worse. But Melissa's greed was a fatal, incurable disease. Even in the face of total annihilation, she refused to let go of the wealth she believed she inherently deserved. She looked around the grand living room, admiring the high vaulted ceilings and the expensive art hanging on the walls. She told Todd they were absolutely not leaving. She reasoned that corporate eviction processes take an immense amount of time. She claimed it would take months for a trust to navigate the housing courts to legally remove them from a residential property. She formulated a desperate, completely illegal plan. She decided they were going to squat in my $2 million estate. She told Todd to go down to the garage and find his heavy toolbox. She ordered him to change every single lock on the front, back, and side doors. She told him to nail the basement windows shut from the inside. She declared that this house was her castle, and she was not going to let a faceless corporation steal it from her without a massive fight. She also realized they needed cash immediately just to survive the week. Their credit cards were useless, and they had exactly $0 in their bank accounts. Melissa looked at my expensive collection of antique furniture, my vintage Persian rugs, and the glass display case in the study holding my rare vintage watches. She smiled a desperate, predatory smile. She told Todd they were going to throw a massive cash-only estate sale this coming weekend. They were going to illegally sell off every single valuable item in my home to wealthy buyers before the authorities could force them out. It was a completely reckless, deeply illegal move born of pure desperation and overwhelming greed. It was exactly the move I knew they would make. It was the absolute perfect setup for the final trap I had already prepared for them. Saturday morning arrived with bright sunshine. My house, the property currently owned by a commercial trust, was completely transformed. Melissa and Todd had spent the last 48 hours tearing through my personal belongings like ravenous scavengers. They were entirely cut off from the banking system. They had absolutely no access to their credit cards. They were starving for liquid cash to survive the weekend and to hire lawyers to fight the trust. Their brilliant, desperate solution was to host a massive cash-only estate sale disguised as an exclusive weekend cocktail party. Through the high-definition security cameras hidden in the ceilings, I watched the absolute desecration of my legacy. Melissa had hired a cheap catering company using the very last few dollars hidden in my emergency kitchen drawer. Waiters walked around my living room carrying trays of cheap champagne. The house was packed with dozens of wealthy, completely oblivious buyers from the surrounding neighborhood. These people thought they were attending a chic liquidation event. They had absolutely no idea they were actively participating in the mass fencing of stolen property. Melissa was standing near the grand fireplace wearing one of her most expensive designer dresses. She was holding a crystal glass and playing the role of the tragic, devoted daughter to absolute perfection. I listened through the hidden microphones as she lied directly to a group of potential buyers. She told them that her poor father had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. She claimed I was permanently relocated to a specialized memory care facility, and she was simply liquidating the estate to pay for my astronomical medical bills. The buyers nodded with deep sympathy and then eagerly handed her thick stacks of $100 bills to purchase my personal belongings. I watched her sell the antique mahogany writing desk I had purchased in London 30 years ago. She sold it to a local doctor for $4,000 in cash. She did not know that desk held the original blueprints for my first logistics warehouse. To her, it was just a piece of old wood blocking her path to a new penthouse. She stuffed the cash directly into a designer handbag resting on the mantel. Her eyes were completely glazed over with absolute greed. She actually believed she was outsmarting me. She thought that converting my physical assets into untraceable paper money would give her the ammunition she needed to fight the invisible trust. In the adjacent study, Todd was operating his own illegal auction. He looked absolutely terrible. His expensive suit was visibly wrinkled, and he had dark, heavy circles under his eyes. The stress of losing his entire software company was physically eating him alive. He was standing behind my heavy oak desk, desperately negotiating with a group of local jewelry collectors. Spread out across the desk was my entire collection of vintage mechanical watches. These were not just watches. They were the physical milestones of my entire life. There was the silver chronograph I bought the day my logistics company went public. There was the gold dress watch my late wife gave me on our 20th anniversary. Todd did not care about the history or the sentimental value. He only cared about the survival of his own inflated ego. I watched him argue aggressively with a buyer over the price of a rare Swiss timepiece. The buyer offered $8,000. Todd, sweating profusely, demanded $10,000, claiming he needed the cash immediately to secure a high-powered corporate lawyer. The buyer hesitated, then pulled a thick envelope of cash from his jacket and counted out $9,000. Todd snatched the money from the desk with trembling hands. He shoved the cash into a brown leather satchel sitting on the floor. He looked exactly like a desperate criminal emptying a bank vault seconds before the police arrived. He was constantly checking his cell phone frantically, waiting for the commercial bank to somehow magically restore his access. He was completely terrified of the invisible wall that had slammed down on his life. But instead of showing humility or remorse, his fear manifested as pure, reckless greed. He moved on to the next buyer, holding up my late wife's diamond tennis bracelet, auctioning it off to the highest bidder without a single shred of hesitation. He was selling the ghost of his mother-in-law just to keep his leased sports car. I sat in my secure recovery suite miles away, watching the live video feed on my secure tablet. My physical therapist had just left after a grueling 2-hour session. My surgically repaired hip was aching with a dull, persistent pain, but I did not take any of the prescribed painkillers. I wanted my mind to be completely clear and focused for the climax of this war. I watched these two parasites strip my life down to the bare studs. A weaker man might have cried seeing his precious memories sold for pennies. A different father might have called the police right then to stop the theft. But I did not lift a finger to intervene. I let them sell the expensive oil paintings right off the walls. I let them sell the vintage watches. I let them fill their designer bags with completely illegal cash. I needed them to commit to the crime completely and publicly. I needed the house completely full of high-profile witnesses. I needed them to hold the stolen money in their own hands so the criminal charges would be absolutely undeniable in a court of law. The more money they collected, the tighter they were wrapping the legal noose around their own necks. They were meticulously building their own prison cell, and I was simply watching the construction. The digital clock on my tablet read 2 in the afternoon. The estate sale was reaching its absolute peak. The grand living room was incredibly loud, with the chatter of wealthy buyers comparing their stolen treasures. Melissa was laughing loudly at a joke told by a neighbor, her designer bag completely bulging with illicit cash. She took a sip of champagne, feeling entirely victorious. In the study, Todd was zipping up his heavy leather satchel. He took a deep, shaky breath, truly believing he finally had enough untraceable money to hire a legal team and start his massive counterattack against Vanguard Horizon. They thought they had successfully survived the storm. They thought they had found a brilliant loophole in my trap. But my trap did not have any loopholes. It only had steel teeth. Suddenly, the entire atmosphere in the living room completely changed. The loud, arrogant chatter began to rapidly die down. The wealthy buyers standing near the massive bay windows stopped talking and started pointing outside. I watched the live feed from the exterior driveway camera. The guests were looking at something large approaching the house. Melissa noticed the sudden silence. She stopped laughing immediately and turned her head toward the front of the property. The smug, victorious smile completely melted off her face in a matter of seconds. Todd walked out of the study tightly clutching his leather satchel full of cash, sensing the immediate shift in the room's energy. He looked out the large glass window and his jaw practically dropped to the floor. A massive, heavy-duty commercial moving truck had just turned onto my private driveway. But it was not alone. It was closely followed by a tight convoy of 3 sleek, entirely black sport utility vehicles. The vehicles did not park respectfully on the street. They drove aggressively up the long driveway, completely blocking in the luxury cars of the wealthy estate sale guests. The trap was no longer an invisible financial mechanism. It was physically driving right up to their front door. The heavy diesel engine of the commercial moving truck rumbled with a deep vibration that actually shook the expensive glass of the living room windows. 3 matte black sport utility vehicles followed the truck in a tight and aggressive formation. They did not park politely along the street. They drove straight up the manicured front lawn, their heavy tires crushing the expensive landscaping and deliberately blocking the long driveway. They formed an impenetrable wall of metal, completely trapping the luxury sedans and sports cars belonging to the wealthy estate sale guests. The trap had physically arrived right at their front door. The atmosphere inside the house shifted from a loud celebration to breathless terror in a matter of seconds. The wealthy doctors, local politicians, and neighborhood gossips stopped drinking their champagne. They crowded around the massive bay windows pointing at the imposing vehicles. Melissa dropped her crystal glass. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, but she did not even look down. Her face turned the color of ash. The smug and victorious smile she had worn all morning melted away entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Todd stood completely frozen in the doorway of the study. He was still clutching the heavy leather satchel, stuffed with thousands of dollars in illicit cash. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He knew exactly what those black vehicles meant. He had seen the exact same corporate security contractors physically throw him out of his own software company just 2 days ago. He knew this was not a mistake. This was the invisible hand of Vanguard Horizon reaching out to crush the very last sanctuary he had left in the world. 12 men stepped out of the black vehicles simultaneously. They were not local police officers. They did not wear standard blue uniforms or carry themselves with the patient demeanor of public servants. They wore identical tactical charcoal suits. They had discreet communication earpieces tucked behind their ears. They moved with terrifying and synchronized military precision. They completely surrounded the perimeter of the house, taking up positions at the front door, the side gates, and the backyard patio. They were a private corporate asset recovery team, and they looked like an army of executioners preparing for a siege. The lead agent stepped forward from the center vehicle. He was a tall and heavily built man with iron gray hair and a face carved from stone. He did not look angry. He looked entirely bored, which made him infinitely more intimidating. He carried a thick metallic clipboard in his left hand. He walked up the stone steps to the front porch with slow and deliberate strides. His heavy boots echoed loudly against the wood, sounding like the ticking of a massive clock counting down to absolute ruin. Melissa desperately tried to regain control of the situation. Her massive ego simply refused to accept that she was completely outmatched. She smoothed down her designer dress, forced her fake smile back onto her face, and threw the front door open before the agent could even knock. She puffed out her chest and tried to project the authority of a wealthy homeowner. She loudly demanded to know who they were and why they were ruining her private weekend cocktail party. She threatened to call the mayor and have them all arrested for trespassing. The lead agent did not even blink. He completely ignored her theatrical outrage. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of her and looked down at her with absolute disgust. He did not lower his voice to speak to her privately. He projected his voice loudly and clearly, ensuring that every single wealthy guest standing in the foyer and the living room could hear his exact words. He introduced himself as Agent Bradley, the Regional Director of Asset Recovery for Vanguard Horizon Commercial Trust. Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but Agent Bradley cut her off instantly. He held up the heavy metallic clipboard. He announced to the entirely silent room that the property they were currently standing inside was legally owned by a commercial corporation. He stated that the previous owner, Richard Caldwell, had lawfully transferred the deed prior to his medical discharge. He looked directly at the wealthy guests holding my antique furniture, my expensive paintings, and my late wife's jewelry. He delivered a legal warning that hit the room like an explosive shockwave. Agent Bradley informed the crowd that Melissa and Todd had absolutely no legal authority to sell a single item inside this house. He stated clearly that every transaction taking place today was completely fraudulent. He explained that purchasing corporate assets from unauthorized individuals constituted the felony receipt of stolen property. He told the terrified guests that they were actively participating in a massive illegal fencing operation, and they were all currently holding stolen corporate evidence in their hands. The reaction was instantaneous and completely chaotic. The wealthy buyers were people who valued their pristine reputations above all else. The mere mention of felony charges and stolen property sent them into an absolute frenzy. A prominent local surgeon immediately dropped the antique vase he had just purchased. A wealthy socialite frantically unhooked the diamond tennis bracelet from her wrist and threw it onto the nearest table as if the metal was burning her skin. The guests realized they had been completely conned. They turned their collective rage entirely onto Melissa and Todd. Dozens of angry people began screaming at my daughter. They demanded their cash back immediately. They called her a thief and a fraud. Melissa backed away from the door, her hands raised defensively, completely overwhelmed by the vicious hostility of her own country club friends. She tried to stammer out an excuse claiming it was a massive misunderstanding, but no one was listening to her lies anymore. The illusion of her grand lifestyle was completely stripped away, exposing the pathetic and desperate criminal hiding underneath the designer clothes. In the middle of the absolute chaos, Todd made a catastrophic decision. His mind completely snapped under the pressure. He looked at the heavy leather satchel in his hands, bulging with nearly $30,000 in untraceable cash. It was the only money he had left in the entire world. He turned his back on the living room and sprinted toward the kitchen, intending to escape through the back door and run into the dense woods behind the property. He did not care about his wife. He only cared about saving himself. He burst through the swinging kitchen doors and collided violently with a wall of solid muscle. 2 of the corporate security agents had already secured the back entrance. They grabbed Todd by the shoulders and slammed him forcefully against the stainless steel refrigerator. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. The heavy leather satchel slipped from his sweaty fingers and hit the tile floor, bursting wide open. Thick stacks of $100 bills spilled out, scattering completely across the kitchen floor. One of the agents pinned Todd against the appliance, while the other calmly knelt down and began collecting the scattered money. The agent informed Todd that the cash was being formally seized as direct evidence of illicit corporate theft. Todd struggled weakly against the agent's iron grip, tears of pure frustration and terror streaming down his face. He sobbed uncontrollably, begging them to leave him just a few $100s so he could buy food. The agents ignored his pathetic pleading completely. Back in the front hallway, Agent Bradley stepped past a completely paralyzed Melissa. He walked directly into the center of the living room and issued a final command to the panicked crowd. He ordered everyone who did not reside in the house to exit the premises immediately. He warned them that anyone remaining inside the property in exactly 2 minutes would be detained and handed over to the local police for criminal processing. The guests did not hesitate for a single second. They practically trampled each other, rushing out the front door, abandoning their stolen purchases and leaving their cash behind. They sprinted across the lawn to their blocked luxury cars, completely desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive disaster of my daughter's life. Melissa was left standing alone in the center of the room, surrounded by abandoned antiques and stern security contractors. The estate sale was over, and the final reckoning had officially arrived. The fleeing guests created a chaotic wave of panic across my front lawn. Luxury cars reversed recklessly over the manicured grass, desperate to escape the corporate blockade. But the mass exodus suddenly ground to a complete halt. A heavy silence fell over the property as a large custom medical transport van pulled slowly up the center of the driveway, parting the sea of black security vehicles. The van parked directly in front of the grand entrance. The rear doors swung open with a heavy metallic clack. A mechanized hydraulic ramp slowly lowered to the pavement. I did not look like the broken, pathetic old man they had left to die on the freezing concrete floor. I did not look like the terrified victim trembling in a hospital bed. I was dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that concealed my heavy medical bandages. I sat perfectly upright in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair. I navigated the chair down the ramp with practiced precision. Jonathan Pierce walked closely by my side, holding a thick leather binder. 2 massive private security contractors flanked me, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. The lingering guests, who had been too shocked to run, stood frozen on the lawn, staring at me in absolute disbelief. Melissa was standing on the front porch. The stolen cash from the estate sale was completely forgotten. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it looked as though she had seen a ghost. In many ways, she had. The father she knew was completely dead. The man rolling up her driveway was the chief executive of her absolute destruction. I maneuvered my wheelchair up the smooth concrete path toward the front steps. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from my daughter. The front door of the house opened behind her. 2 corporate agents marched Todd out onto the porch. They had his arms pinned firmly behind his back. His expensive suit was ruined. His face was stained with tears and sweat. He looked down at me in the wheelchair, and his entire body began to shake uncontrollably. He finally understood the absolute magnitude of his miscalculation. I looked around my property. I saw my antique chairs sitting carelessly on the lawn. I saw my late wife's silver tea set shoved into a cardboard box. I felt a surge of cold, calculated anger, but I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a man who held all the cards. I told Melissa that the estate sale was officially canceled. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward. He opened the leather binder and pulled out a stack of heavily stamped legal documents. He handed them to me. I held up the thick packet of papers so Melissa and Todd could clearly see the golden seals of the state court. I told them these were not the fake downloaded forms they had forced me to sign in the hospital. I explained that I was holding an immediate court-ordered eviction notice for the property they were currently trespassing on. Furthermore, I held the fully executed asset seizure warrants for Vanguard Horizon Ventures. I looked directly into Todd's bloodshot eyes. I told him I had already liquidated his corporate accounts. I told him his software servers were physically seized and his building access was permanently revoked. I watched the last remaining ounce of hope drain completely from his face. He collapsed to his knees right there on the wooden porch, sobbing uncontrollably, begging the security guards to let him go. But Melissa was a completely different breed of monster. Her greed and her arrogance were so deeply ingrained that she literally could not accept her own defeat. Even surrounded by a private army facing absolute financial ruin, she refused to surrender. She looked at the lingering crowd of wealthy neighbors and country club gossips who were watching the scene unfold from the edge of the lawn. She saw an audience and she immediately went to work. She forced a look of absolute hysterical heartbreak onto her face. She burst into violent theatrical tears. She took a step toward my wheelchair, reaching her hands out, as if she wanted to embrace me. The security contractors instantly stepped in front of me, forming a solid wall of muscle completely blocking her path. Melissa stopped and dramatically buried her face in her hands. She wailed loudly, projecting her voice so the entire neighborhood could hear. She cried out that I was having a severe mental breakdown. She shouted to the crowd that I was a deeply sick, senile old man who had escaped from a psychiatric ward. She claimed that the medications had completely destroyed my mind and that I had hired these fake security guards in a fit of paranoid dementia. She pointed a trembling finger at Jonathan Pierce. She accused him of being a corrupt, predatory lawyer who was taking advantage of a mentally incompetent senior citizen. She screamed that she was my legal guardian, and she demanded that someone call the real police to have me safely returned to the hospital before I hurt myself. She played the victim with such absolute terrifying conviction that a few of the lingering neighbors actually began to murmur in sympathy. They looked at me in the wheelchair and wondered if the beautiful crying daughter was telling the truth. She looked at me through her fake tears. She dropped her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper that only I could hear. She told me I was completely pathetic. She said no judge in the world would believe a crazy old man over a devoted daughter. She promised me that the moment the real authorities arrived, she would have me locked in a padded cell for the rest of my miserable life. She still thought she could outsmart me with a few fake tears and a loud voice. I did not interrupt her performance. I let her spin her web of lies. I let her dig her grave as deep as she possibly could. I looked at her with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. I told her that she was an incredible actress. I commended her ability to look a crowd of people in the eye and lie without a single shred of hesitation. But I explained that her performance had one fatal flaw. I told her that in the modern world, words were cheap, but high-definition digital data was absolutely priceless. I reached into the side pocket of my wheelchair and pulled out a sleek silver tablet. I tapped the screen and connected the device directly to the central smart home hub that controlled the massive wireless speakers installed throughout the entire property. I had personally purchased and installed that sound system years ago to listen to jazz music on the patio. Now it was going to serve a much darker purpose. Melissa stopped crying. She looked at the tablet in my hand, and a new, very real kind of terror finally began to creep into her eyes. The stage was perfectly set for the final lethal blow. The murmurs of the panicked crowd hovered in the warm afternoon air. Melissa was still holding her face in her hands, squeezing out forced tears, desperately waiting for the wealthy neighbors to rush forward and comfort her. She was a master manipulator, banking entirely on the standard societal assumption that people will always believe a crying, distraught woman over a disabled old man. She thought she could completely control the narrative. But she fundamentally misunderstood the modern battlefield. We were no longer fighting in the subjective realm of emotion and public opinion. We had firmly entered the absolute unforgiving realm of cold digital evidence. I sat perfectly still in my motorized wheelchair. I looked down at the sleek silver tablet resting securely on my lap. I did not raise my voice to argue with her ridiculous accusations. I did not desperately try to convince the wealthy onlookers that I was completely sane. Defending yourself against a frantic liar only gives their lies unearned validity. Instead, I simply tapped the network settings icon on my digital screen. I looked at the crowd and spoke with a calm, measured authority that easily cut through Melissa's theatrical sobbing. I explained to the silent onlookers that when my wife passed away 5 years ago, I found myself living entirely alone in a very large, empty estate. For my own peace of mind, I had a premium private security firm wire the entire property with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. I installed high-definition cameras and highly sensitive omnidirectional microphones in the hallways, the living room, and the basement. I integrated the entire recording system directly into the central smart home network. Todd and Melissa knew about the basic alarm keypad by the front door, but they thought I was just a clueless senior citizen who could barely operate a television remote. They had absolutely no idea that every single corner of this house was constantly recording audio and video data directly to an encrypted cloud server. I swiped my finger across the tablet screen. A loud, crisp electronic chime suddenly echoed from the massive outdoor speakers mounted under the wooden eaves of the front porch. The exact same chime echoed from the living room and the study inside the house. The entire property was successfully synced to my personal device. The house itself was about to testify against them. When Melissa heard that Bluetooth connection chime, her fake sobbing stopped instantly. She dropped her hands from her face. Her perfectly manicured fingers began trembling violently. She stared at the outdoor speakers, then slowly turned her head to look directly at me. The sociopathic mask of the victims was completely shattered, revealing the absolute naked terror hiding underneath. She suddenly realized what device I was holding. She realized that the basement stairwell was not a silent, unrecorded tomb. I looked directly at the crowd of wealthy neighbors. I told them that my daughter just stood on this porch and claimed I was a senile man, suffering from severe delusions. I told them she just swore she was a devoted, loving caregiver, simply trying to protect her sick father. I asked the crowd to listen very closely to the absolute truth. I told them they were about to hear exactly what happened on Thursday afternoon, just minutes before Melissa and Todd left for a luxury anniversary vacation in Napa Valley. I pressed the play button on the glass screen. For a brief second, there was only the faint static of ambient room noise. Then the crisp, undeniable audio of the basement camera began to broadcast across the entire estate. The volume was perfectly adjusted, carrying the voices clearly across the manicured lawn. The crowd heard Melissa's voice first. It was not the weeping, fragile voice she had just used to beg for their sympathy. It was cruel, harsh, and dripping with absolute venom. The massive speakers blasted her demands. They heard her insulting my age. They heard her aggressively telling me that my slight limp was a liability and demanding that I sign the deed of my house over to her. They heard me refuse her demands. They heard me tell them to pack their bags and vacate my property immediately. The wealthy onlookers stood completely frozen in shock. The local socialite who had defended Melissa just moments ago covered her mouth with both hands. The prominent surgeon who had purchased my writing desk stared at the speakers in absolute horror. The grand illusion of the loving daughter was instantly and entirely incinerated. But the audio recording was not finished. It was about to get much worse. The speakers broadcast the heavy sound of my footsteps moving toward the hallway phone. Then came the sudden, violent sound of physical exertion. The crowd clearly heard Melissa grunt as she shoved me with all her strength. They heard my sharp gasp of absolute surprise. What followed was a sound that made several people in the quiet crowd physically flinch. The heavy booming audio captured the terrifying thud of my body hitting the top wooden step. It captured the chaotic, violent tumbling as I fell backward down the steep stairwell. The microphones picked up the sickening crack of my ribs hitting the wooden railing. And finally, the audio delivered the devastating, bone-crushing impact of my body hitting the solid concrete floor at the bottom of the basement. A woman in the crowd let out a horrified, piercing gasp. Total silence followed the terrible crash on the recording. Only my ragged, agonizing wheezing could be heard echoing from the porch speakers. It was the undeniable sound of an injured man fighting for his life in the absolute dark. On the porch, Todd was sobbing uncontrollably, thrashing weakly against the iron grip of the corporate security agents. He was begging me to turn the audio off. He was screaming that he was incredibly sorry. But I did not touch the tablet. I forced him to stand there and listen to his own damnation. The digital recording continued. The crowd heard cautious footsteps approaching the top of the stairs. They heard the floorboards creak as Todd and Melissa looked down at my broken body. The silence on the tape stretched for 5 agonizing seconds as they decided my fate. Then Todd's voice echoed across the lawn, crisp, clear, and completely devoid of basic human empathy. The high-end speakers amplified his exact, chilling words. Maybe now he will get the message. Let him die down there. The crowd erupted into loud murmurs of absolute revulsion. The final sound on the recording was the heavy, metallic click of the deadbolt, locking me inside the freezing basement, followed by the muffled sound of their luxury car driving away to wine country. I pressed a button on the screen, and the audio completely stopped. The silence that fell over the large property was heavier than lead. It was the absolute silence of total, inescapable judgment. I looked at my daughter. She was no longer standing proudly on the porch. Her knees had completely buckled. She had collapsed against the wooden railing, sliding down until she was sitting on the dirty floorboards. She was staring blankly at the grass, her mind completely destroyed. There were no fake tears left to cry. There were no more lies to spin. Her entire social standing, her pristine reputation, and her complete financial future had just been publicly executed in front of the most influential people in her city. The wealthy neighbors looked at her as if she were a diseased animal. The people who had been drinking her cheap champagne just 20 minutes ago were now stepping backward actively, trying to put as much physical distance between themselves and her as possible. She was completely exposed as a violent sociopathic parasite who had literally left her own father to bleed to death on a concrete floor just so she could steal his house. I placed the silver tablet securely back into the side pocket of my wheelchair. I did not need to say another word to the horrified crowd. The digital evidence had spoken for itself. The silent adjustment was officially complete. I had not laid a single finger on them. I had not thrown a punch or raised my voice in anger. I had simply held up a mirror and forced the entire world to look at the absolute darkness inside their souls. The lethal blow was struck flawlessly, and the monsters were finally permanently slain. The absolute silence that followed the recording was suddenly broken by the sound of a crystal vase shattering on the driveway. One of the wealthy neighbors had simply dropped the stolen antique from her hands. She did not bother to pick up the pieces. She did not ask for a refund. She turned her back on Melissa and began walking rapidly toward her vehicle. That single action broke the spell completely. The remaining guests erupted into a frantic, uncoordinated stampede of self-preservation. These were people who thrived on social status, local political connections, and pristine public images. The sudden realization that they were standing in the middle of an active crime scene holding stolen property while listening to a recorded attempted murder sent them into absolute panic. They dropped everything immediately. Expensive oil paintings were left leaning against the manicured hedges. Vintage silver platters were tossed carelessly onto the front lawn. The wealthy socialites and prominent businessmen practically tripped over each other to get as far away from my daughter as possible. They did not say a single word of comfort to Melissa. They treated her like she was highly contagious. The private corporate security agents stepped aside, creating a clear path for the fleeing guests, but they kept a sharp eye on the abandoned merchandise. The agents did not stop anyone from leaving the property, but they ensured that not a single piece of my legacy left the estate. I sat in my wheelchair and watched the grand illusion of my daughter's social life evaporate into thin air. For 3 years, she had built her entire identity around impressing these superficial people. She had bought their friendship with my money. She had hosted their lavish parties using my credit cards. She had desperately craved their validation. And now, the very second the dark truth was exposed, They abandoned her without a single backward glance. The luxury sedans and sports cars that were previously blocked by the black security vehicles were now frantically maneuvering across my crushed landscaping. Expensive tires tore deep trenches into the green grass as the guests desperately squeezed past the corporate blockade. Within 3 minutes, the once crowded front lawn was completely empty save for the abandoned antiques scattered across the grass and the security team maintaining the iron perimeter. Melissa remained sitting on the dirty floorboards of the front porch. She was completely paralyzed. The reality of her total social annihilation had short-circuited her brain. She stared blankly at the torn-up grass, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the magnitude of her destruction. Todd was still pinned against the exterior wall of the house by 2 security agents, his head hanging down in absolute defeat. The silence returned to the estate, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the heavy, expectant quiet that precedes a massive storm. Then a new sound pierced the warm afternoon air. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail, echoing from the main road at the bottom of the long hill. Within seconds, the sound grew louder and more distinct. It was the unmistakable, aggressive blare of multiple police sirens approaching at high speed. Melissa snapped her head up. The blank stare vanished entirely, replaced instantly by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading for the first time in her life. She realized that the corporate security team was not the final punishment. She finally understood that losing the house, the money, and the social standing was only the preliminary phase of her nightmare. The sirens were growing exponentially louder, bouncing off the surrounding trees and echoing across the large property with terrifying clarity. Todd began to thrash violently against the grip of the security agents. He screamed that he could not go to state prison. He sobbed uncontrollably, begging me to call the authorities off. He pleaded that it was just a terrible mistake, that he never actually meant to hurt me, that he was just angry and stressed about his business. His pathetic whining was completely drowned out by the deafening sound of the approaching sirens. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I simply stared at him with cold, detached observation. The time for apologies had expired the moment he locked that basement door. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward from his position beside my wheelchair. He looked down at Melissa, who was now trembling so violently she could barely keep herself upright against the wooden railing. Jonathan adjusted his suit jacket and spoke with the calm, measured tone of a man who had orchestrated this exact sequence of events, down to the very last second. He told Melissa that the local police department was not responding to a simple noise complaint or a neighborhood dispute. He explained that precisely 10 minutes before our corporate convoy arrived at the estate, he had personally contacted the chief of police. Jonathan stated that he had already securely transmitted the digital audio recording of the basement incident directly to the lead detective of the Criminal Investigation Division. He informed her that he had also provided them with the fraudulent hospital documents she had forced me to sign, proving her malicious intent to steal my assets while I was incapacitated. He looked directly into her terrified eyes and delivered the final piece of information. He told her that the officers currently speeding up the hill were not coming to ask questions or mediate a family disagreement. They were responding to an active judge-approved felony warrant for aggravated assault, elder abuse, and attempted manslaughter. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. She looked at the flashing red and blue lights that were now reflecting violently off the tall trees at the edge of the driveway. 3 marked police cruisers tore through the open front gates, their tires screeching loudly as they hit the pavement. They swerved aggressively onto the property, boxing in the black security vehicles and completely cutting off any possible avenue of escape. The trap was fully closed. The financial empire had been dismantled. The stolen property had been recovered. The social standing had been completely obliterated. Now the final phase of the silent adjustment was stepping out of those police cruisers to collect the physical debt. I rested my hands calmly on the armrests of my wheelchair, perfectly positioned to watch my daughter face the absolute consequences of her own monstrous greed. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the black and white police cruisers. They moved with absolute terrifying authority, their hands resting securely on their heavy-duty belts. Behind them, an unmarked gray sedan pulled up and parked on the crushed grass of my front lawn. The driver's side door opened, and Detective Lawson stepped out into the warm afternoon air. He was the exact same detective who had visited my hospital room just 2 days ago. He was the man I had lied to about tripping in the dark. He looked at the massive private security perimeter, the abandoned antiques scattered across the driveway, and finally he locked eyes with me sitting in my motorized wheelchair. He did not look angry that I had deceived him. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of professional respect crossed his weathered face. He understood instantly that my lie in the hospital was not an act of fear. It was a calculated tactical maneuver designed to gather absolute undeniable evidence of their crimes. Jonathan Pierce walked down the smooth concrete path to meet the detective halfway. They did not exchange pleasantries or shake hands. Jonathan simply handed Detective Lawson the silver tablet and a thick manila envelope containing the legally voided power of attorney documents. Lawson opened the video file on the digital screen. The uniformed officers immediately formed a tight perimeter around the front porch, ensuring Melissa and Todd could not make a desperate run for the dense woods behind the house. I watched Detective Lawson's face as he viewed the high-definition security footage from my basement stairwell. The bright tablet screen reflected clearly in his observant eyes. He watched my own daughter press her hands against my chest and shove me backward into the dark. He watched my body shatter against the hard concrete floor. Then the crisp audio played from the tablet speaker. Lawson heard Todd deliver his chilling death sentence. The detective's jaw tightened. The professional neutrality completely vanished from his expression, replaced instantly by a look of profound, absolute disgust. He handed the tablet back to Jonathan Pierce without saying a single word. He turned his attention entirely to the front porch. Detective Lawson walked slowly up the wooden steps. Melissa backed away from him until her spine hit the heavy front door. She held her hands up defensively, her chest heaving with uncontrolled panic. She desperately tried to revive her shattered victim persona one last time. She stammered that the video was taken completely out of context. She claimed she simply tripped and bumped into me by accident. She pointed a shaking finger at me and shouted that I was a vindictive old man trying to ruin her life because I was suffering from severe dementia. Detective Lawson did not even pause his stride. He stepped directly into her personal space and grabbed her right wrist with a grip like iron. He told her to save her pathetic lies for the judge. He forcefully pulled her arm behind her back. Melissa screamed in genuine shock as the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped tightly around her wrist. The sharp, metallic click echoed loudly across the silent property. It was the absolute final sound of her freedom ending. Lawson grabbed her other arm completely, ignoring her violent thrashing, and secured the heavy steel cuffs together. He read her the Miranda rights in a loud, monotone voice that entirely drowned out her hysterical sobbing. He formally charged her with felony elder abuse, aggravated assault, and attempted manslaughter. He stated that because she had locked the door and left the state while I was bleeding on a concrete floor, she was also being charged with depraved heart, reckless endangerment. Melissa stopped fighting. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. If the detective had not been holding her up by her arms, she would have collapsed into a pathetic heap on the dirty floorboards. The pristine designer dress she had worn to impress the wealthy neighborhood was now severely wrinkled and stained with sweat. Her perfect, glamorous life was officially dead. Todd watched his wife get handcuffed with wide, terrified eyes. He instantly realized that his only remaining option was to completely betray the woman he had married. The cowardice that defined his entire existence took absolute control over his brain. He pressed his back against the exterior wall of the house and pointed directly at Melissa. He shouted to the police officers that he had absolutely nothing to do with the physical assault. He screamed that she was crazy, that she had pushed me in a fit of sudden rage, and that he had been too terrified of her violent temper to call an ambulance. He actually tried to claim that he was a victim of her domestic manipulation. Melissa snapped her head up. The ultimate betrayal from her own husband ignited a brief, venomous spark of pure hatred in her eyes. She screamed back at him, her voice cracking with absolute fury. She shouted that it was his idea to lock the door. She yelled to the police officers that Todd was the one who said to let me die down there so they could steal the house and fund his pathetic failing tech startup. They were completely destroying each other right there on my front porch, gladly trading their marital vows for desperate, futile attempts to save their own skins. Detective Lawson looked at Todd with a level of contempt usually reserved for actual insects. He signaled to two of the uniformed officers. They marched quickly up the steps, grabbed Todd by the shoulders, and aggressively spun him around. Todd sobbed and begged as the officers slammed him face first against the wooden siding of the house. They pulled his arms roughly behind his back and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Lawson stood right next to Todd's ear and informed him that the digital audio clearly recorded his voice sealing my fate. The detective stated that the legal duty of care laws in this state made Todd entirely culpable for my injuries. He formally arrested Todd as an accessory to felony elder abuse, accessory to attempted manslaughter, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Todd completely broke down, crying loudly and helplessly, like a frightened child, as the officers patted him down and emptied his expensive pockets. The police officers gripped Melissa and Todd firmly by their arms and began marching them down the wooden steps. This was the ultimate walk of absolute shame. They were paraded past the scattered remnants of their illegal estate sale. They walked past the expensive antique furniture they had desperately tried to steal from me. They walked past the private corporate security agents who had completely dismantled their financial empire in a single morning. I sat in my wheelchair at the bottom of the steps, perfectly still, watching them approach. As they were led past me, Melissa stopped fighting the officers for a brief second. She turned her head and looked directly into my eyes. She expected to see a gloating father. She expected to see righteous anger or triumphant joy. But I gave her absolutely nothing. I looked at her with the cold, empty detachment one might use to look at a piece of trash blowing across the street. I was completely dead to her, and she was entirely dead to me. The officers shoved her forward, breaking the eye contact forever. They were escorted to separate police cruisers. An officer placed a heavy hand on top of Melissa's head and pushed her down into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the vehicle. The heavy door slammed shut, locking her inside a metal cage. Todd was loaded into the cruiser parked right behind her, still sobbing uncontrollably about his frozen bank accounts and his ruined future. The sirens remained off, but the bright red and blue lights continued to flash silently, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across my driveway. The parasites had been surgically removed from my life, and the infection was finally cured. The police officer placed a firm hand on Todd's shoulder, preparing to push him down into the cramped back seat of the cruiser. But Todd planted his expensive leather shoes into the crushed grass of the lawn and resisted. He did not try to run or fight the officer. He simply turned his tear-stained face back toward me. He looked absolutely pathetic. The arrogant tech executive who had swaggered through my hallways was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, broken child. He dropped to his knees right there beside the open door of the police car, ignoring the stern command of the officer to stand up. Todd looked at me and began to beg. He did not beg for forgiveness for leaving me in the dark. He did not apologize for my shattered hip or the excruciating pain I had endured on the concrete floor. His diseased mind was still entirely focused on his own greed and his desperate need for status. He sobbed uncontrollably, pleading with me to unfreeze his corporate accounts. He shouted that his software was weeks away from a major public launch. He promised he would pay me back every single cent of the $3 million with heavy interest. He claimed that if I let Vanguard Horizon destroy the company now, I would be throwing away a massive return on my investment. He was actually trying to pitch me a business deal while wearing steel handcuffs on his way to state prison. I maneuvered my motorized wheelchair across the driveway, stopping just a few feet away from where he kneeled on the grass. The police officer looked at me and took a single step back, silently granting me the space to deliver my final words to the man who had tried to end my life. I looked down at Todd. I did not feel a shred of anger anymore. I only felt a cold, clinical certainty. I told him that he completely misunderstood the fundamental nature of my investment. I explained that I never gave him $3 million because I believed in his software or his visionary leadership. I told him I knew his company was entirely worthless from the very first day. Todd stopped sobbing, for a fraction of a second, his face twisting in absolute confusion. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single word pierced directly through his massive ego. I told him I funded his ridiculous startup for one reason only. I did it to protect my daughter from the financial ruin he was actively dragging her into. I explained that the money was simply a quarantine measure designed to keep his complete incompetence from destroying the roof over her head. But I told him that giving a parasite an unlimited food supply only makes the parasite grow larger and more aggressive. The money did not make him a better man, it only amplified the monster he already was. Todd shook his head frantically, denying the reality of his own mediocrity. He cried out that he was a genius and that he had built an empire from nothing. I leaned forward in my wheelchair. I told him he built absolutely nothing. I told him his entire life was a carefully funded illusion. I was the foundation. I was the walls. I was the roof. And the exact moment I decided to walk away, his entire world instantly collapsed into dust. I told him that Vanguard Horizon Ventures was not going to restructure his debt. The commercial trust was not going to offer him a severance package. I stated with absolute finality that the company was going to be completely liquidated, sold off for scrap, and erased from the corporate registry by the end of the month. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The absolute truth finally crushed the very last pillar of his delusion. He realized he was not a titan of industry. He was just a beggar who had violently bitten the only hand that ever fed him. I delivered my final verdict. I told him that when he locked that basement door and told my daughter to let me die, he thought he was making a ruthless business decision. I told him I was simply making mine. I looked the police officer directly in the eyes and nodded once. The officer grabbed Todd by the collar of his ruined suit and hoisted him forcefully to his feet. Todd did not fight back anymore. All the arrogant energy had completely drained from his body. He was entirely hollow. The officer guided him into the back of the cruiser and slammed the heavy door shut. The loud metallic thud echoed across the lawn, sealing him inside. I turned my wheelchair around and began rolling slowly back toward the porch. The final exchange was over. The silent adjustment was permanent. I watched the 3 police cruisers drive slowly down the long, winding driveway of my estate. The harsh red and blue lights painted the trunks of the ancient oak trees, flashing rhythmically, until they finally disappeared beyond the heavy iron gates. The loud wail of the sirens faded into a distant hollow echo before being completely swallowed by the quiet afternoon breeze. They were gone. The 2 people who had stood at the top of my basement stairs and coldly calculated my death were now sitting in the back of police cars heading toward a concrete cell. I sat in my wheelchair at the base of the front porch, letting the absolute silence of the property wash over me. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of the dark basement. It was the crisp, clean silence of a surgical extraction. The infection had been completely removed from the host. Agent Bradley stepped down from the wooden porch and walked over to my chair. He held his metallic clipboard at his side, his posture relaxed for the first time since his team had arrived. He informed me that the perimeter was fully secured. The wealthy neighbors had abandoned every single piece of stolen property, and his men had successfully moved all my antique furniture, paintings, and vintage watches back inside the house. He asked me for my final instructions regarding the remaining items upstairs. I looked up at the second-floor windows. That was where Melissa and Todd had lived for 2 years, rent-free. That was where they had plotted to throw me into a state-funded nursing home. I did not want a single trace of their existence lingering inside my walls for another night. I told Agent Bradley to bring his men inside. I instructed him to go up to the master bedroom and gather every piece of clothing, every cheap pair of shoes, and every useless cosmetic bottle they had left behind. I was very specific about the method. I told him not to use my good suitcases or proper moving boxes. I ordered him to pack their entire miserable lives into heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. I wanted them tossed onto the edge of the street by the front gate, exactly where the city garbage trucks did their weekly pickups. If Melissa and Todd ever managed to post bail using a public defender, they would have to come collect their pathetic belongings from the gutter right where they belonged. Bradley nodded once, completely understanding the cold finality of the order. He turned and signaled his team. The men in the charcoal suits marched efficiently into my home to begin the final purge. Jonathan Pierce walked over and stood quietly beside my wheelchair. He looked at the crushed landscaping and the tire marks tearing through the pristine front lawn. He casually mentioned that he would have a landscaping crew out here first thing Monday morning to repair the damage. I thanked him, but I honestly did not care about the grass. The physical damage to the property could be fixed with a single phone call and a checkbook. The physical damage to my body would take much longer to heal. A sharp, burning ache radiated deep inside my reconstructed hip. The heavy painkillers had completely worn off, and the sheer exhaustion of the afternoon was settling heavily into my bones. I was a 65-year-old man with a broken body. I would need months of grueling physical therapy just to walk unassisted again. The betrayal of my own flesh and blood had carved a deep scar into my soul that would never truly fade. But as I rested my hand on the joystick of my wheelchair, I did not feel weak. I felt entirely invincible. They had tried to break me and steal my kingdom, but they had fundamentally miscalculated the absolute strength of the king. I thanked Jonathan for his flawless execution of our legal strategy. I told him I was going inside to rest. I pushed the control stick forward, and the electric motor hummed quietly to life. I guided the wheelchair up the wooden floorboards of the front porch. I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer. The house was finally empty, completely peaceful and entirely mine. I closed the heavy mahogany door behind me, locking the parasites out forever, ready to begin the rest of my life. The greatest lie we are taught is that family deserves our unconditional sacrifice, even when they offer nothing but contempt in return. I learned that your bloodline does not give anyone the right to treat you like a decaying asset. When you unconditionally fund someone else's life, you do not buy their respect. You simply finance their absolute arrogance. My greatest victory was not destroying my daughter's financial empire. It was finally realizing my own self-worth. I learned that the most powerful response to deep betrayal is not screaming or crying. It is executing a cold and silent adjustment that permanently removes the parasites from your life. If you believe that respect must be earned regardless of family ties, hit the subscribe button and share your own story of setting unbreakable boundaries in the comments below.